Hi everyone, this is Different Class. I'm Nathan, and this is Jonathan.
Hello.
We're continuing our State of Emergency series of events in April by looking at the politics of migration and critical moments when emergencies are declared. Embedded within the language of and political responses to the movement of people are all sorts of assumptions about and attitudes towards the relationship of human beings to modern states. The sovereignty of a state is at a very fundamental level defined by borders and who is and isn't a part of its community. Such is the sensitivity of the idea of a state to the idea of its control of borders, that any disruption to border claims and the right to control access can very quickly become framed as an existential threat. This is true, of course, of individual state borders as well as the borders of areas of shared sovereignty, such as the European Union. The text we're reading this month is titled Biopolitical Borders and the State of Exception in the European Migration Crisis by Dr Daria Davitti. This is the most specific case study, if you like, that we've looked at so far in this State of Emergency series at Different Class. We're going to use the text, as we always do with Different Class, to help inform a broader discussion of migration, the politics of emergency, and the meaning of biopolitics. Our event will be on Wednesday, 21st of April, and it's on Zoom, as ever. So, Jonathan, are issues to do with migration inherently always a kind of emergency?
I think there's a sense in which they are. Clearly, migration, although it can be pursued in very many different ways for different motives, there's often a sense of desperation about those who engage in certain forms of cross-border migration. And so we might see it almost as a kind of state of emergency declared by those who are themselves migrants. But of course, at the same time, it's also got a link to emergencies inherently insofar as migration is something that's often on the edges of the law, not least because many states increasingly in the present either try to make cross-border migration something that's illegal, or at least make it very difficult to pursue in a legal fashion. And therefore, there's always going to be a somewhat difficult relationship between the act of migration and the rule of law, which is, of course, not to say that there may be not very good reasons to engage in migration. And of course, I think the link to emergency politics in the contemporary period and in Europe and the European Union is, I think, magnified to the extent that many governments of the last decade or so have been increasingly concerned about the capacity of other parties at home, opposition parties, far-right parties, or any kind of right-wing party, their capacity to turn migration into a political issue and potentially to garner a lot of popular support by doing so. And so this desire to ward off the threat of a right-wing politics that turns migration into a salient issue is something that leaves a lot of governments wanting to themselves highlight migration, to themselves highlight it as a problem, and to exactly cultivate a sense of emergency around it so that they can present themselves as taking decisive action in response to it. So I think in each of these ways, there is quite a close link between migration, especially as it's conducted in the present, and especially as it's conducted by those who are unable to pursue it in a straightforward and indeed legal fashion, and the politics of emergency, as we've touched on it in previous sessions.
So that really understands, or what you've just said, sort of understands migration as an issue for nations and nation states. There is an interesting transnational aspect to it as well, isn't there? Especially in more recent times, where issues of migration seem to escape the sovereignty of individual states in some way.
Yes, that's right. Especially in contemporary Europe and in the context of the European Union, I think what's interesting here is that although conventionally we often associate emergency politics with the politics of sovereignty, with the capacity of an executive, a state government to assert their right to bend the law, to state exceptions and so on to the law. What's interesting in the case of migration, it is, of course, inherently somehow a transnational issue, but it's also one that is governed in the European context, especially with the involvement of institutions other than the sovereign state. So I'm thinking here, and this is something that the text by Davitti in question goes into in some detail, I'm thinking of supranational institutions such as the European Commission, a whole range of EU agencies which are specific to particular kinds of governing area. So Europol, for example, which is the policing agency, Frontex, a whole range of functional agencies that are dedicated to particular aspects of migration control. So this is a politics of emergency which is got a range of actors other than the sovereign state involved, supranational forms of emergency rule. Of course, the European Union is not a context, however, in which the sovereign state disappears. So what's interesting also is the interplay between rules, regimes of policy at the transnational level, and nation states that occasionally want to break with these rules. So there's almost a new form of exceptionism that becomes possible in the context of the European Union, which is state governments declaring the need to suspend, to waive obligations of the European Union, of transnational law, and so on. And of course, in the period that we're interested in this week, especially around 2015, 2016, what comes to be known as the migration crisis in Europe, it's notable in this period the extent to which we see governments suspending the Schengen regime, in other words, this policy regime of free movement for European citizens within the European Union. And the very fact that they can suspend those rules, in some sense, is itself a way in which to magnify the urgency of the situation and convey to populations back home that they are acting decisively and so on. And then maybe as a third final element, I think what's interesting on this theme of institutions other than the state as central to a distinctive form of emergency politics here, you get the involvement of third-party actors such as NATO, a bit like in the Eurozone crisis that we looked at a while ago, the involvement of the Troika and the International Monetary Fund. You're seeing these kind of institutions that are not of the EU, they're not of the supranational sphere of the EU, and yet they're somehow being drawn into the complex arrangements of emergency rule that one sees in these moments of crisis. And of course, for clear political reasons. I mean, there's reasons why governments want to involve these type of external agents, because to some degree they can shift responsibility for some difficult distinctions between who is a refugee and who is a migrant. They can shift these decisions to third-party actors and allow them to get on with some of the dirtier work of migration policing as it comes to be enacted in this context. So it's a kind of distinctive context where we can't really talk about emergency rule as just the preserve of the nation state, of the state executive magnifying its authority under conditions of crisis. There's a whole range of different institutions involved here that makes for something quite unique, I think.
Okay. So I think migration opens up a really very interesting dimension for our state of emergency series and takes us off in a slightly new direction. I think it's going to be a fascinating topic to look at further. So just as a reminder, our next event is on Wednesday, 21st of April, is on Zoom. It's open to everyone. Details will either be with this video or on an email you will have received. And we look forward to seeing you there.
See you then.